What was life in the era of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, like for women, or let's say for aristocratic women, to narrow it down a little bit? I know
Yeah,
this is a big question,
it's a
but
big
let's just
question.
start big.
It's big, but it's important. So I'm glad that that's where we're starting. To be an aristocratic woman in Augustan sort of Rome, it's a chaotic time. This is a place that has just gone through massive sort of civil wars, and the legacy that we're going to see with the Julias is part of the consequence of a real upheaval that Rome has faced. And there's no question that Rome is in a state of flux. People aren't sure what their lives are going to be like, and they're not sure what decisions are the right decisions to make. And because it's been in a warlike sort of state, I think people are feeling a bit free and easy about, well, maybe feeling a little bit fatalistic. Like maybe I could try anything, I could do anything, I could become anybody under the right sort of circumstances. And there seems to be those tantalizing possibilities for elite Roman women to be free of some of the sort of the legal shackles that they've been constrained to and some of the political shackles as well. But this is going to lead to a lot of really interesting things happening and maybe stirring up a little bit of trouble as well.
Yeah, I think that in the late Republic, we see far more women who we know by name. We can trace some of their actions. We can trace some of their relationships in a bit more detail because usually with women in Rome, they're not talked about in the same level of detail in terms of political developments and that sort of thing as we see for some of the women in the late Republic. And I think that's because we increasingly see men coming to the fore, rather than like a body like the Senate. We see individual men, generals, politicians coming more to the fore in the late Republic. And that means that their family members, including the women, have the potential to exercise, I suppose, a little bit more soft power than they might have in a previous period. So you see women like Fulvia, for example, who come to the fore due to her relationship with several politicians, but probably most notably people like Mark Antony. And that, I think there's the legacy of that as we go into Augustan Rome as well, because with Augustus being sort of the last man standing after the Civil War, it also thrusts his female relatives into more prominence than they might have been previously.
All right. Not. I mean, I realize that every historian adores the period they research, of course, and I don't want to instigate a beef between the people I invite to Eurotrash, but I'm gonna do just that a little bit because I had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Nieto Isabel. We talked about women's spirituality and mysticism in the Middle Ages. It was a fascinating conversation. And she said that contrary to popular belief, women enjoyed quite a lot of freedoms in the Middle Ages. It was only when picking up Rome's ancient model of gender roles in the Renaissance do we get this oppression of women that we now associate with that period. Until she said that, I thought, in the words of the great Maximus, aka Russell Crowe, Rome is the light. What do you think of that?
Look, Rome is definitely a huge patriarchal culture. Of that, there is no question. And in the Augustan period, this is pretty much just as true as for all of Rome's history. And arguably, as we get further into Augustus sort of consolidating his power, it's going to become more patriarchal. And the sort of subversion that you hope for from women is maybe going to be pushed down a little bit harsher by the sorts of things that happen under Augustus's rule. Women have a very distinct place. It's pretty constrained in many respects. The fact that elite women have some freedoms is impressive, but this is not a world that I think women would want to go back in time to live in. Not at all.
No, I think it's in comparison to, say, classical Greece, it seems like Roman women have a good deal because they
Okay.
seem to have a bit more freedom than some of the women you read about in, say, Athens. But that's not saying much. they're still quite constrained and restricted by their gender and the roles that they are required to play.
Fair enough. Is it the same for working class women for women who are not aristocrats? Is it similar, or is it different? Or do
It's
we not
possible.
know much about that?
It's possibly worse. At least like for
All
elite
right,
women,
great.
yeah, like elite women do get some sort of benefits, and particularly what we see under Augustus is he has this moral reform legislation, which actually frees up some elite women to live a little bit more on their own terms rather than under the strict guardianship of a male relative. But working class women, women who are enslaved, freed women, their constraints are even heavier, and they're not really released from a lot of these things. In order for a freed woman, for instance, to gain the same benefits as an elite woman, and this is only for some of those benefits, she has to produce more children than an elite woman would, for instance. So the further down the hierarchy you go, the more difficult your life becomes, essentially.
Yeah, because Roman women, one of the things that sets them apart from, say, again, Greek women, just using them as a comparison, they can actually own property. They can inherit and own property in their own right, which, if you're an elite woman, might mean that you could potentially be wealthy if you happen to have, if you're in a family where they only have girls, or all the men die off, or whatever. You might be lucky. So you could potentially inherit a reasonable amount of wealth, which might give you a bit more of that sort of, soft power in a sense, because you're a wealthy person. People aren't going to necessarily dismiss you, perhaps.